Council with Alliance for a Better Utah. We'd like to welcome you here to our second annual post-legislative session panel. This panel tonight is being sponsored by our 501c3 affiliate, the ABU Education Fund. The ABU Education Fund. The ABU Education Fund is committed to civic engagement and good governance in Utah. To fulfill this mission, the Education Fund hosts panel. This panel is to look at the major issues that we've all been hearing about over the past 7 weeks from a variety of perspectives. For that reason, we've invited a legislator, a civil rights activist, and a couple of lobbyists to talk about their experiences over the course of the legislative session. We even have one of those pesky reporters to help moderate the discussion tonight. With that, I'm going to introduce our moderator and panelists, and then I'll let you all hear from them rather than me because, frankly, I'm pretty new to the legislature and have no idea what I'm talking about. First, we have Senator Luz Escamilla. She represents District 1, and she is the Assistant Minority Whip for the Democrats in the Senate. She serves on a handful of committees, including the Executive Appropriations, and had a lot to do with the budget this year for the Democrats. As a part-time legislator, she also works as a banker and consultant. Next, we have Mike Bailey. He is an attorney and lobbyist with Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer. He's a shareholder in the Litigation and Government Relations Department there, and his practice includes lobbying at the legislature, as well as petitioning county and city governments throughout Utah. Thank you, Mike, for being here. Next, we have Spencer Stokes. He is a lobbyist and president of Stokes Strategies, a political consulting and government relations firm. In his past, he was executive director of the Utah Republican Party, and also...
I'm waiting for the big applause coming up.
And he was also chief of staff for Senator Mike Lee in Washington, D.C. Next, we have Anna Thomas. Anna Thomas is Strategic Communications Manager with the ACLU of Utah.
And once I wore a Mike Lee t-shirt.
She joined the ACLU of Utah in December 2007 and has worked in a variety of roles there. She has done a lot of work, especially with criminal justice reform. So thank you for our panelists. Our moderator tonight is Glenn Mills, who works with ABC4 Utah. Good for Utah. He joined ABC4 Utah in June 2013 and is an award-winning journalist. You can catch him anchoring ABC4 Utah News at 4 Monday through Friday. He also serves as Good for Utah's chief political correspondent, keeping you up to date on issues that impact your life at the city, state, and national level. His political reports run throughout the week, and he hosts Utah's only statewide political talk show, Inside Utah Politics, Sunday mornings at 8 o'clock. So catch him there. And I'm going to hand it over to Glenn.
Thank you very much. I'm happy to be here along with our panelists tonight. And I would just say one thing to you, Chase. I think when it comes to politics, if we're honest, we would all have to say none of us know what we're talking about. We just pretend like we do. That's what it's all about. Looking at this session, yes. So because of the mic situation, we're not going to be able to get. Because of the mic situation, we're not going to be able to get out to you in the audience. But we do have this website set up. You can see here, and that's where you'll be able to go on and ask a question. At the end of the panel, we're going to try to reserve some time for questions from you in the audience. So that's how you will be able to submit them through that website right there. From a media standpoint, I would have to say that this session took on a unique personality of its own. It was quite a bit different than others that I have covered in the past. Going into the session, we thought we knew. Of course, we're always going for the big controversial stories in the media, right? We thought we knew and had those down, but they all kind of fizzled out, and other stories came out of nowhere, and we're going to be talking a little bit about that throughout the panel discussion. But panelists, I'd like to start with public education funding, because I think that was certainly one of the big issues from the panel, or from the legislative session that came out this year. We have the governor and we have legislative leaders proclaiming a big victory for education. Yet, on the other hand, we have a ballot initiative moving forward because some say education is still not being funded enough. So, Senator Escamilla, I'd like to start with you. And my question is, was education a winner or a loser this legislative session?
I've said that we've been on the losing side on education for a decade. I've been in the legislature for 9 years, and we're still to this point not able to cover the growth. Since we stopped covering growth in 2009, we haven't been able to do that. So, I have a difficult time when the governor and other legislators say, "Oh, we're already, up to date on our education funding." We're not even close. I'll tell you what's different, and this is a practice that started about 3 years ago under the new leadership, and that's Senator Niederhauser and Greg Hughes, where the Speaker Hughes, where we now go in cutting everything. So we start our appropriations process, which we do for the first 2 weeks intensely of the session, and we start with doomsday. And I think it has created a psychological process where people think it's the end of the world once we walk in. And then we're like, hey, by the way, the revenues were not that bad, we're okay. So that's been kind of like the practice for a couple of years, and education has been feeling that impact. So that's why people are like, we're not gonna have any growth, we're not gonna have any more funding. And then we're like, okay, we can do 4%. The Democratic, the minority caucuses, both the House and the Senate, came up with a budget, and our budget had a 4.5 increase. I mean, we balanced our budget, and we balanced out a 4.5 increase versus a 4% that came out as a final budget piece. So we still think we could do more for education, and we were disappointed we didn't hit the 4.5.
Most of new money coming in is going toward education. So let's pick up on that where you say you think you could do more. Where could more money come from for education? To any of you panelist members.
Well, I would say it can't come from indigent defense reform, which is sort of a key issue for the ACLU for years and years and years. We saw a very small increase in appropriations for the Indigent Defense Commission, about a $500,000 increase for what we estimate to be a $40 to $50 million problem in the state. So I would agree with Senator Escamilla's assessment that we sort of operate from a doomsday mentality in our state. We're already not adequately funding a lot of constitutional obligations that we have. So anytime cuts are promised or we're balancing the budget with restrictions, in our minds, we think of all the things that we're not providing, that we're required to by the Constitution, like legal counsel for people who can't afford it on their own, that have not even been calculated into the process.
Great spin to your topic. I mean, that is impressive. Look, I've become convinced that education and economic development go hand in hand. In order to have a state that is successful now and into the future, you have to fund education. And we spectacularly have not really been able to keep up with growth. And keep in mind that all the dollars that come in through income tax are dedicated constitutionally to education. So, it's great that the money that came into the income tax got spent where it's supposed to be, but we are falling behind every year because we have large families, we have a growing state, and $240 million were appropriated to education, which seems like an immense amount of money, but it is not. And so in the next few weeks, you're going to see Our Schools Now, which is a lot of business leaders in the state, propose a tax increase in one fashion or another. It hasn't really been decided whether it's going to be 7/8 of 1% for income tax, or a combination of income tax and sales tax, or all sales tax. So you're going to see that move forward in the form of an initiative, and we just all need to be very honest with ourselves. A legislature made up of 2/3 Republican in the House, majorities in the House and the Senate, are not going to raise taxes. It's not going to happen. So if it's going to be done, the people are going to have to do it, which is going to bring out lots of cries about we don't want to look like California and have initiatives done. But that's the only way you're going to fund education. Last legislative session, not this one, but the year before, they did equalization, which amounted to about a $75 million tax increase, which was really earth-shattering that happened. And they funded about $75 million in roads, new road sales tax. So it's $150 million, and I believe that was the max that's ever going to happen through the legislature. And it was done because it was kind of nobody really understood how it was being done. You know, that's how it got done. So,
you know, I couldn't agree with Spencer more. And one of the tricky things about education is there are so many issues where you have to try to predict what's going to happen in the future. With education, you know, we know exactly who's already alive, who's going to need to be educated in the next couple of years. And so it makes the argument for the referendum even stronger. You know, one other thing I wanted to point out is that Representative Joel Briscoe just walked into the Impact Hub.
next time we'd like you to come on time. This is an important presentation, Representative.
Yeah, I
You're
don't.
supposed to be up here.
Yeah, I don't think that there can ever be a representative at one of these and not be on the stage. So we'll see if we can't find another chair.
Let's talk.
Can I just add
Sure.
something? Thank you. I just want to add, so one of the things that we need to discuss, so one is that initiative, and I think I agree. I don't know that we can have this major tax reform. Even though I'll say this, President Niederhauser was very adamant to have major tax reform take place this session. It didn't happen. But one of the things that was promised, and you know, I give credit one to Representative Briscoe and Senator DeBacchus, members of our caucuses, where we've been talking about how many tax exemptions are out there for businesses and corporations. And we've counted almost 100 of them. So the promise is that during interim committee, we will be reviewing each one of them. Because I think there's hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars left in that component. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It means that it's time for reviewing them. Some of them have been in place for 20 plus years. And I think that's going to be part of the conversation as we go into an initiative that will be impacting everyone.
Spencer, I believe it was you that brought up we don't want to become like California where you can get an initiative on the ballot. And by design in Utah, it's a little more difficult to get on the ballot an initiative. With the backing that our schools now has, do you see this as a successful initiative moving forward and getting on the ballot? And two, will voters pass a tax increase to fund education?
There's no question it will get on the ballot. That will happen. Requires, I believe, about 115,000 signatures, something like that. But they'll get the signatures. They'll get them with volunteers and with paid signature gatherers. So we'll get on the ballot. Look, our state has a new dynamic which has hit here in the last few years, and that's Americans for Prosperity. I would imagine to see Americans for Prosperity out strong to try to defeat it. We have the organization Libertas, and they're going to love this video footage. They'll get this video footage and put it on their website, and as well as the Utah Taxpayers Association. Those three entities will be driving forces to go after this. Let me say, however, that the people of Utah understand that education is the #1 priority in the state in any polling you look at. And so I believe it can be passed. It's going to be an uphill battle, obviously. The legislature, there were several pieces of legislation this year to make it more difficult. There was a piece of legislation that required the amount that the tax would increase to be put in bold letters above every signature line. And how can you, if you're an organization that's trying to gather signatures, how can you argue against transparency? But this was done directly in the face of an organization made up of the business leaders of the state that are trying to really help the economy out. We got it amended. There was no way to kill it because who can argue against transparency? So now it's not above every signature. It's just at the top of the page and at the bottom of the page. And so there were attempts to do that during this session, but I believe it'll pass. And it's going to be narrow, but I believe it'll pass.
I'm going to do another clever pivot, but it's relevant. And just the ACLU doesn't typically weigh in on tax policy, but the reluctance to increase taxes to pay for common goods like education and public safety have real ramifications. So we've seen this when we're working on criminal justice reform, because people don't want to pay increased taxes for what we all benefit from, which is getting people off the street when they commit serious crimes. Instead of raising taxes, we just develop a very complicated set of fees and fines where people who are put through the criminal justice system are perceived to be paying their own way when that is not in fact the case. So even this year, when there was a push to pass serious reform to our juvenile justice system, there was significant pushback from the courts and other areas over loss of funding, because part of the way they fund themselves is through fees and fines, not through taxes. So I think it's a very important conversation to have. What is important to us as a community, and how do we feel about sharing that load together in an honest way?
All right, a lot more to come on that as we watch how the ballot initiative develops over the next few months. Let's move on to alcohol policy. This is one of the issues I am talking about that tend to creep up on us and came out of nowhere. All of a sudden, the governor is looking at a bill that could make us the first state in the entire country to lower our legal BAC to 0.05. Is this a good policy? 0.08 to 0.05.
So I'll take the first shot at this. So I think this is a very tricky issue. If you look on the website, you look at Representative Thurston's website. He ran the bill from the House side. There appears to be some compelling science as to the importance of lowering the amount. I personally think that there's a chance that all sorts of young people will get swept in and get DUIs under this law. And the problem is that if you have employment, if you're seeking employment where driving a car or anything would ever be at stake, it's going to be very difficult to get a job if you have a DUI, regardless of what the standard is. In addition, you're going to have to disclose it on a bar exam. You're going to have to disclose it on a law school application, and it's very tricky. So one of the things that's most interesting about the bill, I think, is that the effective date of the bill is December 30th, 2018. So it's not going to be effective until there's at least one more legislative session. So what does that mean? Who knows? What will happen? Who knows?
One thing I will add to that is that I've already heard talk of potential amendments being presented next legislative session before this would kick in, by the way.
I just wanted to add to something that Mike said, and maybe a correction. Again, the ACLU is not necessarily concerned with alcohol policy on its face, but our concern is not that young people will get stopped, but the people who are more likely to get pulled over by law enforcement, people of color primarily, will be caught up under this law more than others. So if you think about it, and I know there's some compelling evidence on either side about how much impairment is caused at 0.05 versus 0.08. 0.05 is more prevalent as a threshold in some European countries where they also don't rely on driving as much as we do. But if you think of the things that people are likely to be pulled over for, weaving in and out of lanes, failing to signal, those may or may not be actual indications of intoxication, and people of color are more likely to be pulled over by law enforcement just generally for those kinds of infractions. And so we actually see some of the negative consequences of this implementation 47 years in the future, of increased criminal charges, arrests, increased length of stay, in jail, and then all those collateral consequences that we've talked about, losing your driver's license, having a record that you have to report for ages, will actually disproportionately impact communities of color in Utah, which, given the current political climate, are already feeling somewhat under the gun and persecuted.
You know, I voted against the bill, and I think, I want to say at least our caucus was everyone against it. Partisan vote. But what was interesting in the conversation is, I mean, going back to the science, it's hard to argue against DUIs and, you know, driving under the influence. So I don't know that there was compelling information enough in terms of science and this difference between the 0.08 and 0.05. The Europe comment is like comparing apples to oranges. I mean, we're already weird enough in Utah. And we said this, it's like, look, we're probably not it's not in our best interest when our number one revenue maker is tourism to go this route. I mean, is this sending the right message? And the hotels, you know, I mean, restaurants, they're very concerned on how this looks like and for them, how it will impact the economy of the state. So there's an economic impact. And really, going back, as we continue to have our massive reforms on criminal justice, and we realize that locking people up is not the answer. Here we are now, another penalty, another enhancement, and I don't know that that's the right approach. To me, it's not good public policy, and we made national news, of course, and we're hearing from all people. I mean, I'm getting emails from all over the world saying, you know what, I was thinking about Zion National Park, or not anymore, you guys are crazy, and it really, I don't know that that's the right message we want to send.
Spencer, I see your mind turning, but before you weigh in here, I want to bring up something that Representative Thurston and other supporters brought up, and they said the message here is, if you're going to drink, don't get behind the wheel.
Then go 0.0.
Yeah, so comment on that.
Well, we have this strange fascination with alcohol and sex, and I mean, the polygamy stuff is mind-boggling as well, but and marijuana. So we spend a lot of time on these things. And that it appears to me, I don't think the last chapter has been written on this yet, by the way, and we often do this to ourselves. We start out with this obsession, and we pass something in haste. We make it delayed a year, and so the only thing we get out of it is really negative press. And when if we just started from the beginning and took a more sound, I don't think there's anybody more shocked about this passing than Representative Thurston. I honestly believe I started talking with him at the beginning of the session, and he threw it out there as just some mud against the wall to see what would happen. And I think he's like, well, what happened? You know, I've never passed this kind of controversial bill before. Why did it happen this year? So it was happening in the same, the same can as alcohol reform, and so to some extent, I think some people thought maybe this was part of that, and it just. What they should have done was reached over and grabbed it and pulled it into alcohol reform and taken a more measured approach. But you have to understand that 104 people, it's a very organic thing. I mean, the legislature does not often end where it starts. You know, ideas get thrown out. Lots of people could not believe the polygamy bill passed. It won by one vote in the Senate, but it was the very last item on the calendar that day, and got moved up based on a vote by a member of the Senate who has had a family member involved in polygamy, and it was really a lot of favors. A lot of people didn't really want to vote that way, but felt bad about this situation. So it's like I said, it's very, you'll put air quotes around it, organic.
I kept thinking that Senator DeBacchus or Senator Davis were just going to keep talking until the clock struck midnight. That's what
Well, that would be obvious. That would be the obvious strategy, right? Wouldn't that be the obvious strategy? Because
They run out of ideas. It was so long.
no, you cannot tell me for 1 second that DeBacchus ran out of ideas of what to say. I mean, come on.
Honestly, that's how it appeared to me. I felt like he had in his mind he was going to talk until midnight, but perhaps he did run out of things to say. And I thought the same thing when Senator Davis came up.
Yeah, it was the alcohol bill. Let me tell you why there's some inconsistency to your point about how sometimes things happen in a weird way. I don't know if you guys know this, but we passed a bill that in Salt Lake County, ATVs can now drive up to 50 miles an hour in the regular road. So think about how dangerous and how, to me, that's
Actually, side by side.
Side by side, but can you imagine? I mean, Highland Drive, 700 East, people died in crashes there in vehicles. Now they're going to be on ATVs riding by your side, so be aware. And we passed this bill, I'm thinking, wait, you're concerned about 0.05, but you're not concerned about an ATV? I mean, we passed a helmet bill for up to 21, and that was a monumental effort, right? I mean, how their government tells me how to live my life. So it's funny how you have these discrepancies in thoughts. And going back to that bigamy bill, yeah, I think they were trying really hard, but there's also, that last hour is probably the worst hour. I mean, there's a lot of people waiting. You see, the board fill of bills, and those people are hoping their bills will come up, by the way. I mean, as someone that had the bill passed the bill at 11:49 p.m. So I was the last one coming in. Regretted walking into that vote because the hope was everybody was going to talk till midnight. That did not happen. So we ended up having to vote on that bill. But I think that was in a way an intention. But you're right. I mean, it was an emotional issue. There was a lot of people hurt through that process, and that last 4 hours at the Capitol, if you were there, you probably saw a lot of movement in a way that I've never seen in 9 years with regards to the issue of bigamy.
Okay.
Look, there's more freedom today because you can be a little bit intoxicated on your side by side, dragging your Traeger grill behind you, smoking meat, and wearing a helmet. I mean, talk about freedom. That's what I say.
That's Utah for you.
And you won't have to get it inspected in the future.
Yes.
Okay, I want to hit on the other alcohol bill, House Bill 442, but I want to make this quick because we still have a lot of other things I want to get to. Basically what we have is an alternative to the Zion Curtain. The bill sponsor saying, yes, we brought down the Zion Curtain, but there's this buffer zone. Your thoughts on that? Is this the right policy in moving forward in the state of Utah? Is it a step in the right direction?
Science moat is what they're calling it.
Yeah, the Zion moat is what they're calling it.
We didn't weigh in on this particular piece of legislation, but I will say, sort of I think echoes what Senator Escamilla was saying just about the inexplicability of it all sometimes as you see fights in one area over safety and then things just flying through on the other side without a conversation about it. I think what is troubling to a lot of people is just the underlying argument here just does not hold any water. The whole idea of why there has to be some sort of separation in restaurants between people who are eating, people who are drinking. I've never heard, just as an average citizen, a compelling argument for why that needs to happen at all. So it was sort of interesting working on a lot of other bills and legislation and watching this argument unwind just how much effort, how much torturous effort was going into how to structure the policy. At one point, a bunch of us were laughing and scratching our heads about the fact that somebody made a random proposal, it didn't make it into the final bill, that if you were going to order a bottle of wine at dinner, you couldn't just have 2 people because then they would drink too much. You would have to have 3, which led to a lot of hilarious jokes about how the bigamy bill better not pass because I would need a second husband to take out so we could order a bottle of wine. But there were just all of these permutations of reasoning around this idea that there's some problem that needs to be solved in these public places around drinking, which I've never seen evidence that there is that problem.
Let's take another look at it, though, from a standpoint of if some people had their way, there would be prohibition, correct? So, is this a happy medium? Is it a way to compromise for the two different sides and trains of thoughts here?
I mean, we certainly don't have the screwiest alcohol laws in the country. I mean, there are a lot of other states that are far more weird than us. It's focused on a lot here because we have a predominant religion, and lots of people think that predominant religion controls how everything's going to happen when it comes to alcohol, and to some extent, not the prominent religion, but the people who are members of the prominent religion make assumptions, large, vast assumptions. And I went to the first kind of meeting that was held from coalition standpoint to try to talk about this in the very beginning. And what I said was, until this rises to the level that the hate crimes and religious freedoms bill rose to at 47 East South Temple, there is really no reason to sit down and have this discussion because, there are people making assumptions in the legislature that are LDS, and you have kind of mid-level, bureaucrats at the church giving input on it. But until it rises to the level of saying, let's analyze this with the right people, it really doesn't make a lot of sense to do this. I will tell you that I grew up in a time when my mother made a lot of Kool-Aid. I mean, I saw her behind the counter. She dumped the water in, she dumped the sugar in, she dumped a little packet in of Kool-Aid, and she stirred it up, and it was in one of those Kool-Aid pitchers, the Hey Kool-Aid pitcher with a big smile on, and it was fascinating to watch. Today, I am not addicted to Kool-Aid because I saw her mixing that. So I don't understand that argument. So, but
to that point, I think it was either the last week of session or the second to last week of session during his media availability. One of the members of the media corps asked the governor, "Is there any evidence that a child will not drink if they don't watch drinks being mixed?" And he answered to the negative of that. So to that point.
yeah.
He's a reasonable man.
Well, like I said, the final chapter on this has not been written. I do believe that the reason why the Zion Curtain came down was less about watching drinks being mixed by children and was more to the point by owners of establishments that said, I can't monitor what's going in that drink. I can't monitor how much is going in, how much alcohol is going in there. It's being done out of my sight as well. I can't monitor what's being put in that drink and delivered to a table. And those things, I believe, which are solid arguments, were the reasons the Zion Curtain came down. The fact that anybody thought there was negative PR around it was not the reason the Zion Curtain came down. It was that there were good, solid reasons by business owners that was a bad thing for the health, safety, and welfare of the people visiting their establishment.
All right, let's move on to air quality, something we all have that is very important to all of us. Senator Escamilla, you are a member of the bipartisan Clean Air Caucus. Seemed a little quiet on the air quality front this legislative session. Give us an idea of any progress that we made.
So yeah, we were more quiet than the previous years, and we've had less bills than previous years. And I think because we came all in with the psyche that there was no funding, revenue was down, and we didn't want to get a lot of bills. And also the fact that there were 1,200 bills filed, which was a historical number. So that also impacts the type of bills that you have and how we work. I mean, when you already are being told, don't even bother, your bill is never going to be drafted, because you're, you know, behind 1,000 bills. So that really created, I think that was part of why the legislature, this legislative session was different. Because people were not even sure their 5, you know, priority bills will even, the first 3 priority bills will be drafted, period. So that was one issue with air quality. So one thing is, because of the revenue issue, there was hardly any funding at the beginning of the funding process. So if you remember the first executive appropriation that provided that funding piece. And then it came on the last part. The governor heard, it was pretty clear from their policy advisory committee, the Air Quality Policy Board, I believe that's the name, that they needed the funding because they were gonna have some issues now that this new administration was coming in, the Trump administration, and how that's impacting our own process to deal with that. Our monitors are like, I don't know, 150 years old, so they're not working anymore. That's an issue. I had a bill that did not, something weird happened in the committee, and I'll leave it at that because it was just awful. In the Natural Resources Committee.
Is that the prison bill?
That was my prison bill. So what I was trying to, so listen, this is interesting, because we were trying to say, look, okay, so the state prison is gonna be built in this odd place that's already costing $100 million extra that we were calculating. We knew that, it's an expensive place to build. Shouldn't be building anything there, period. But now we're building there, and we are, you know, expecting about 1 million tons of fill to be there, you know, to be transported in the next 4 months. And we already have really bad air quality in this area. So, I mean, can we start at least monitoring and reporting and having people be empowered with information? And that could not even get a vote. I mean, it was just the saddest thing in the world. But that's the attitude some of my colleagues have. They're like, well, that's a Salt Lake County issue, Salt Lake City issue. And I'm like, yeah, and it's a state issue, and that's why we're here, and it's the capital of the state, and now you're building a state prison there, so we need to address that. And this attitude of, well, you know, I have 20 million fills coming to my county, and I'm fine. I'm like, yeah, totally different issue. This is not about, you know, the difference between rural Utah and urban, and that's another issue. In the legislature, it comes up all the time. Is this attitude of, oh, Salt Lake City's always complaining. I'm like, we're choking, we're dying here. Are you not breathing right now the bad air that we have? And they just look at it. It's like, well, it's not my district. I don't care. Even though they're breathing the same air during the legislative session, which is weird.
How much does out of sight, out of mind play in air quality legislation? It seems like the years that we have extended poor air quality, it seems to be on the minds, and we're talking about it more.
Children go. Yeah, I mean, the kids go to the Capitol when they're having problems, and that raises issues.
You remember about 2 years ago, we had a big clean air year, and we had a horrible inversion right at the start of the session. So I actually think that there is some small impact. You know, one of the other bills that passed this year that's going to help in cleaning up the air is the Tier 3 fuel incentive bill. And so I think there were some strides made for clean air, and I think they were significant.
I'm hoping that everyone, I've got a new car coming out, it's called the Colt. It's like the Volt, but it's coal operated. And very popular, and I'm going to try to get it under the Trump administration license as a Tier 3 vehicle. The Colt coming to you soon.
All right. Do you have anything to add to that?
No, it's just, you know, watching my fellow activists who work in that particular realm is a struggle. Because there are so many bills introduced and there are so many serious and pressing problems, if it's not staring you right in the face, it's really, really hard to get people to relate to it. And unfortunately, air quality is one of these things that it doesn't stop and start. It's a long-term issue, and we have to be working on it constantly. So it's just one of those frustrations. Sometimes your issue takes off at the Capitol for a particular reason, and sometimes it doesn't, even though it's totally valuable and very important.
Can I just say one other thing, and that is that it's pretty clear from all the studies that the way we're going to clean the air up is through vehicles. You know, that
The Colt.
yeah,
The dealership near you.
the primary problem for clean air is all of us driving. And so as I was driving today, I looked and nearly everybody on the freeway was the only driver in the car. And then I looked at cars that were passing me in the carpool lane, and they all had bought those little passes, and for the most part, they were all individuals.
Spoken like the lobbyist for UTA, right here. Yeah.
It's all true. And so I'm not even going to go to the point where I'm telling you that transit is the answer, although it is. But you know, one of the things that's going to be very important is we're all going to have to figure out, whether it's through transit or through carpooling, we're really going to have to figure that out. And it really starts with me, because I drive by myself almost every day.
I'm idling my Suburban around the corner right now. But look, I take it in a much different view of this, and my view is I want clean air, probably for many different reasons than people in the room. I want clean air because it's beautiful, and if you've ever walked out of the Capitol on a beautiful, crisp afternoon in February and the blue skies are amazing, that is really, it's an economic development thing for me. It's really less about, and I have a daughter who has asthma, she's a runner, and it kills her. I get the clean air arguments, I get the health risk arguments, but I think we should be focusing on the fact that this is an economic development. When I have clients in town and they see that, the reaction is amazing. I had a client just the other day say, "This is spectacular." Now, I've also had clients in town during the inversion, and they have been like, "Oh my hell, what's going on here?" So I view it as an economic development issue.
Well, and this is why we live here. I mean, if we didn't want to be able to see the mountains, we'd all move to Denver.
All right, Anna, I want to move on to the death penalty. Last year, the Senate passed a bill to abolish the death penalty altogether. We have a Speaker of the House currently who favors that movement, yet the bill never came up this year. Why not?
So there are a lot of reasons, and I think the main reason I would say is political uncertainty. You know, last year we had this amazing confluence of perfect circumstances. We had a champion in Steve Urquhart, who had built up years of political capital as a Republican legislator from St. George, who just really came to own this issue and was willing to spend a lot of that political capital on this issue as he moved out of the legislature. And we also had momentum from other states. Nebraska had just passed legislation as well. And there was a ton of national interest and support in seeing something similar happen in Utah. So even though we're in a very red state and we've been working on this for years without a ton of measurable progress, we just went for it. The ACLU and all of our death penalty abolition partners. This year, I think we can all relate a little bit. After the elections, just not really quite knowing what the results would entail at the Capitol. And that's not just to say that the major changes at the federal level, but you know, we had a lot of new legislators up at the Capitol, and we didn't have existing relationships with them yet. We hadn't been able to see where everybody was on the death penalty. And it's one of those issues that is incredibly important and takes so much work. Calling in favors, making sure that people are just working the floor all the time. And I think that among our coalition, we looked at how much work we'd have to put in versus all of this political uncertainty and everything else that was going on, and saying, is this really the year to make this push, or do we want to hold off?
But we did see a couple of debates on death penalty issues. We had bills dealing with human traffickers, making them eligible for the death penalty. Anyone who kills a police officer. So what did you note from those discussions that could potentially move this abolition issue forward?
Well, so the human trafficking amendments, which I always say is not about human trafficking. It's about expanding the death penalty, because threatening people with death will not stop human trafficking. It's a much more complex problem. But for the second year in a row, that bill proposed by Representative Paul Ray of Clearfield failed to clear the legislative process. And so I think it shows it's difficult for legislators to take a stand on an issue like the death penalty, which already can be a little tricky. It's hard to talk about. It can be controversial when it's wedded to something as painful and terrible as human trafficking. Nobody wants to look like the legislator who's for human trafficking, although that's not really the way that the argument falls. But I think it says a lot that that bill barely passed the House of Representatives. Then it got a Senate committee hearing and it died. And I think that there was also a bill by Representative Steve Handy to have a legislative audit of the fiscal impacts of the death penalty, not just how much execution and incarceration cost, but just the cost of capital trials and all of the appeals and these kinds of things. So I think that the message that we were pushing and our allies were pushing, that, hey, before we expand its use, as the rest of the nation is drawing back from using the death penalty, let's find out a little more about its fiscal impacts first.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes, so I want to get to two other questions real quick. Let's move on to the tax reform talks. There was talk of potentially bringing back the sales tax on food and then lowering it in other areas. The governor and other legislators have said it's coming back through the interim and next year. Where do we see that going?
So interim, but I'll say this. I think the reason why you have no sales tax on food is because the legislators got an earful on that from their constituents. No matter where you're in the state of Utah, it's not fair. People don't like it. It's very punitive. It really hurts low-income working class families. And it doesn't matter if you say, well, it's only, I have people say, it's only a couple $100s a year. I'm like, wow, I can tell you've never been in the working class.
That's right.
When you see people with their phone and the calculator, and this is real. This is for some people. It's between, yeah, I can buy cheese or not. I cannot get milk for my kids. The idea that you can just be that punitive and say, well, that's going to flat the tax and everybody's going to be equal. I'm like, no, that just doesn't work like that. So I'll tell you this. I give credit to the House. I saw all the House members running the little ads on Facebook, like, this is to help families, and you will be protected, and you will see just all the hating, messages. I'm like, oh, how does that come to you? It's like, oh, it's horrible. This is a bad idea. So they heard from the constituents. I think that was really the pushback. We were ready to say, no, this is not the good approach. Our constituents were really clear also on with the Democrats, and all of our districts were up in arms about it. So I don't know that that's an approach. I respect the fact that, our Senate president has been a big proponent, and I think he realized that there was probably no votes in there at this point, but you will see a tax reform. That is already something that everybody agrees that we need to review that, including reviewing all those tax exemptions, which is critical that we do.
Where might tax reform go?
Well, that's a question
In 3 minutes.
I can't answer, but I will tell you that tax reform is going to happen because, I don't know where it'll go, but there is a community pushing for more funding for education. And the only way you're going to get E1 and our schools now to back off of going to the people, which legislators do not like, they do not like direct legislation to the people, will be if they do something with tax reform. You cannot continue. We've lost in public education $1.2 billion annually. $1.2 billion annually through several shifts. One was the flat tax to 5%, one was the sales tax off food, and the other was the constitutional amendment a number of years ago, which allowed higher education to be funded out of public education and the income tax. So there will be something. Whether it will be large enough to stop an initiative going forward, I think really the technical term is referendum. But most people understand initiative better. Whether that moves forward, but something's going to have to be done for that to be stopped.
It's not sustainable.
Okay. We have about 5 minutes before we're going to turn it over to questions from the audience. I have one last question I want to address to you. An example, last year's line item veto of the education funding for certain projects really created a lot of backlash, and people were contacting the governor and telling him, this isn't good, you need to redo this, and he went back on it. He went back on his veto. So my question is this. Governor Herbert now sits in a situation where he has already said he's not going to run again. Do you see his approach any different given that fact when he takes a look at the bills that are before his desk right now? Is he still going to be open to backlash and frustration from people on certain bills as he was in the past, given the circumstances that he is in now?
I would have said yes, except he didn't veto the, what ended up us losing hundreds of millions of dollars with the outdoor retailers on the barriers. So no, I guess he's still gonna be the same governor and listening to his, his group. Very disappointing that he signed that resolution out of all things. It's like, oh, totally unnecessary, and we lost so much as a state. Again, not needed. So no, I thought that, because he did announce he's not running, I'm like, well, maybe we will see some surprise. And by the way, I've been very surprised when we've taken some positions and very pleasantly surprised. But on this one, I was disappointed, so I'll say, no, I think he's gonna just be, the same Governor Herbert in terms of those vetoes.
And I always like to remind people that Governor Herbert has been very responsive in the past when there's been a large public outcry about something. Sex ed proposal, grandma rollback, there was responsiveness. And so I feel our legislature and definitely our governor is more responsive than people usually give them credit for. In a lot of ways, it just doesn't happen in ways that you necessarily see or anticipate. I would say that even though the governor has not indicated that he'll run for re-election, he does have to continue to work with the legislature for multiple years. And I think that everybody has a certain amount of capital to spend with other people. A lot of it is based on relationships of respect and interaction. And so just from what I know about how the governor interacts with people, I can't see him saying, I'm just gonna go crazy for the next few years. And also I think he has some very deeply held political beliefs, like on Bears Ears, or we've seen that on same-sex marriage, that you might not agree with him, but he feels very strongly about, and he'll stick by those. And then there are other issues where he's definitely more flexible.
Just to be clear, in case I said he hasn't indicated he's going to run again, he's told me he's not going to run again. Just to be clear.
Right. Orrin Hatch said that. Did he tell you that?
Not personally.
Excellent reality.
So the governor's, I think, greatest quality is he does have deep held philosophical beliefs, but he's also stable. He's been a very stable governor for the state. And a lot of things he does not get credit for. For example, we don't have a permitless concealed carry law this year because the governor said to Representative Lee Perry, you change it or I will veto it again. So, those kinds of signals, and Lee Perry dropped it. And so, you have to give the governor credit for, a lot of people say, well, he's spineless, he won't veto. But once again, he has political capital. He knows when to use the political capital. He knows when not to use the political capital. And that was one where he weighed in early, and I think he should be applauded for it because it was the right public policy move. But you're not going to see the governor be unusually out of character from what you've seen the last number of years. He is who he is. And that is a calm, stable influence on a very dynamic political environment. I mean, I have heard the legislative session described as, I won't say who I've heard it by, but I've heard the legislative session described as when all of your grandchildren come over for Thanksgiving dinner and the tables are overturned and the garbage cans are dumped out and the but they all go home and the whole capital gets put back together again. There is something about that stable influence, because it is a wild ride for 45 days. Nobody knows how it's going to turn out, but so I think you're going to see the same governor you've always seen.
All right, Mike, we have about 1 more minute if you'd like to respond.
Oh, the only thing I'd say is I agree again with Spencer, and one of the things that we just don't know, and we don't know, and you probably don't know either, is exactly which bills the governor has been working on behind the scenes during the session. And so as a result, if you don't see a number of vetoes, that doesn't mean that the governor and the governor's office haven't been working behind the scenes during the session to ensure that they got the bills the way they want them. So anyway, he's been a very good leader for the state, and it's just hard to tell without knowing exactly what they're doing behind the scenes.
All right, we are now going to turn the time over to questions from you in the audience. Chase, how are we going to do that? Okay. So we have the first one, Matt Conway. Are you in the audience? Okay, Matt is right here. So Matt's question is, with none of our 6 members of our congressional delegation being from Salt Lake County, which makes up 41% of Utah's population, what kind of legislation could we move forward with to make sure we have more balanced representation in the state? Don't everyone go at once here.
None. I mean, there's nothing you can do about that. I mean, you can say all day long you want to have a commission to realign congressional boundaries, but you got to remember, even if you do put a commission together, we've shown in this state that we're not going to have. It's going to be a nonpartisan, which means it will be all Republican. The boundary, the commission that's put together. So constitutionally, it has to be equal representation, and this is, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but that is never going to change in the state of Utah.
I'll say referendum. It's about time. So there is a movement towards an initiative to stop gerrymandering, which has been mastered here in the state of Utah. I give them credit for that. And as someone that was crazy enough to run for Congress in 2014, and was driving from Bountiful to St. George to cover one district, realized that that's not effective and it's not fair for rural Utah as much as it is for this area. So, I think there is a need for balance. I agree that it's not going to be a 180. That's not realistic, but at least to get 1 seat or 2, I think is possible. Maybe not the U.S. Senate seats, but for sure one congressional district if we do a true redistricting process, which happens in other states. I mean, it's not unheard of. So hopefully I've seen conversations and been in conversations about a very aggressive initiative process for that, and hopefully that will put us where we need to be, because that's the only way we're going to change not only congressional districts, but also some balance in the legislature.
And I would say to that, I mean, we at the ACLU of Utah work much more on the state level, and thank God we leave most of the federal stuff to our national office. It's a very difficult time to get excited, and it has been for a while, to get excited about movement on the congressional level. The drum I usually beat as someone who represents a nonpartisan organization that sues whoever is in office, regardless of party, is if you feel yourself being very frustrated with the lack of equal representation from the two-party system, I would just encourage you to push beyond that. There is a lot of work that can be done at the local and state level, regardless of political party affiliation. I can tell you from my experience nationwide, all of our ACLU state affiliates, regardless of whether they're in the bluest state or the reddest state, are struggling with very serious civil liberties violations and governmental abuses of power. To some extent, it doesn't matter who's in office. There are systemic, long-term problems that need to be solved. And there are some things that living in a very red state, we're actually much more lucky about than some of our colleagues in the rest of the ACLU. So I would say the ACLU's position on redistricting and gerrymandering is that there should be a more independent process. Politicians shouldn't be able to pick their voters. Voters should be able to pick their elected officials. But aside from that, I would say, I think that's a good thing to pursue, but also work on issue areas where there actually is a lot of flexibility to gain common ground in Utah. And I've seen that at the legislature.
I just have to make one. Okay, so there's 5 Democrats in the Utah State Senate, okay? You can do everything you want in drawing lines. You might get 6. Maybe 7. You've had 7, a high of 7. And the same in the legislature. There are just not enough Democrats to elect more than that in the state. And people always say, well, I can't believe this representative is introducing this legislation. Representatives, that word representative, they're doing, by and large, what the people who elect them to do want them to do, the majority of them. So they kind of look like the communities they represent. I mean, honestly.
That's true, but if LeVar Christensen gets defeated by 3 votes, and you notice this year he didn't pass as much insane anti-LGBT legislation as usually he goes for, I think that in some of these moderate districts, even when you speak out and you don't elect somebody of your party, you are having an impact at the Capitol with your vote, whether you win or you lose. I do see that.
One other thing I think is important to bring up. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think you just said Utah mastered gerrymandering.
Yeah.
Okay. Is it fair to say that it's just Utah, though, or are states that are controlled mostly by a Democratic legislature doing the same things?
Hawaii has not a single senator that's Republican. So I mean, to the point. I mean, you think Hawaii, you give Utah maybe those 2 opposite places, but I think there are more House districts that could flip, in some of the lines. The Senate is a little more difficult, I agree, just based on just masses of population. But I think we can at least pick up, if we do a true redistricting, when you go by the numbers, because we had that in 2010, we can at least pick up 3, 4 maybe, and at least 5 in the House.
It's just whose gerrymandering do you like, I think is really what it comes down to. Because Republicans in this state didn't dream up gerrymandering. I mean, it's been going on forever, and it's been happening in Republican and in Democrat states.
But
and
Republicans tend to be better at it.
well, we're better at it here because we control the legislature, and in states that are all Democrat, they're better at it. It just depends.
I was just going to say, I come from the market I came from before I came to Salt Lake City was a very conservative portion of western Colorado, and conservatives there had the same frustrations because they were mostly grouped in with a more liberal Front Range area of Colorado. And so I kind of heard the same frustrations just from a different angle.
Well, and in my other life, I've taught election law at the law school level, and I will tell you that some of the most amazing gerrymandering cases are cases where Democrats have actually gone down one street for about 7 miles and then gone into another sector. So there is absolutely no question that both parties are extremely good at it when they need to be or want to be.
So I didn't really talk about an actual party.
Hang on, are you Tommy? What's your name? Were you the person who asked the question?
Yes.
What's your name?
My name's Matt.
Oh, Matt. Okay, I couldn't remember. All right, Matt.
So,
Yeah.
I mean, I was talking about geography too. Not just party. And I know that that's kind of like a cover-up for party because, of course, Salt Lake is, but it is geographic as well. And also, I'm from Arizona originally, which in 2000.
Didn't you get the memo that we didn't want you here? Didn't you get that memo?
Well, the grad
We
student
don't-
did. So, but like the thing is, in Arizona in 2001, I believe, they did exactly that with gerrymandering. They did an independent commission when it was actually like 64% Republican. They did 2 Republicans, 2 Democrats, and 1 independent. And the state freaked out, but it was done by really legit propositions because Arizona can do propositions a lot easier, which can be scary and positive. But they did that in 2001, and it still exists today. And now there are very, very equitable districts. I think it's the best in the entire country.
Well,
that's done in a Republican state.
That's amazing because Arizona politics are crazy.
They are crazy. They've always
I mean, they make
All
this look
politics are
normal.
crazy.
So, but you have to understand that you've arrived to a welcome. Thank you for being here. Thank you for coming in spite of Bears Ears, and thank you for being here. But the reality is that you just saw a state legislature that took away partisan designations for boards and commissions. So my hunch is we're not going back the other direction of setting up a nonpartisan commission. And so it's going to take years.
How do we make the referendum then better? Much easier for us.
Let me tell you, this is how. The Supreme Court has in Utah, when it's challenged, has been moving to make things by the public and the voters more easy, more simple than they have the other direction. And so every time I see someone challenge something, and we saw this with state school board, access to the ballot, we've seen this with the SB 54 debates to the Utah Supreme Court. The more challenges that the Utah Supreme Court has in front of it, I believe you'll see the public having a greater say. Now that's just Spencer Stokes talking, but I've seen it happen in the past. But you saw access to the ballot granted, although in the final hours, fortunately polygamy was there to stop the change to, I can't remember, House bill. It was a bill that basically allowed the parties to decide how their nomination process. It was substituted in the House at the last minute, about a half an hour before the end of the session, and it allowed the parties to decide whether they wanted signatures for the nomination, caucuses for the nomination, or a combination of both. Now, what do you suppose the Utah Republican Party in this state would have picked had that bill gone through? Oh, let me guess, caucuses. Yeah, that'd be it. And to some extent, the Democratic Party suffers the same. They like caucuses too, because the more extremes get elected if you have the caucus system. We haven't seen the end of signature gathering. We may have seen the end of caucuses, but stay tuned.
So did that.
All right, let's move on to another question. You ready, Chase? All right, this one comes from Timothy Dunn. Timothy, are you here? Okay, there's Timothy. With all the talk of tax increases for education as well as reform of the justice system, why have we ignored our surrounding states' success with recreational marijuana?
Oh, I don't think it's been ignored. Believe you me. And this was another issue where we saw a lot more movement in recent years, and then this year sort of fizzled. There were a lot of proposals that the advocates for drug policy reform that we work with felt were just totally insufficient, especially around medical marijuana to suit the needs of patients.
Another champion.
Exactly. And that's been a tricky thing, is people who are willing to step out. And I think, honestly, just from a drug policy and criminal justice policy perspective, this is just something that we've been doing for so long, and we're so obsessed with the apparent dangerous health and criminal ramifications of medical marijuana or any marijuana use. I think it's going to take a long time for Utah to get to even medical marijuana, but I think it is not quite correct to characterize it as being ignored. I do remind people, we've had folks from outside the state of Utah come to us and say, well, why isn't the economic argument for medical marijuana more persuasive here? And, just like, look at our liquor laws. I mean, if an economic argument were going to make sense, we would have privatized that industry and taxed it up the wazoo ages ago. And so I think that there are people, and they're not all progressive Democrats. There are lots of libertarians and conservative Republicans that would be interested in getting into this area of commercially available medical marijuana. There's just a lot of cultural resistance and from the law enforcement community as well, and just entrenched interests that make it difficult. But I don't think it's being ignored.
And in terms of the recreational, my answer will be gambling. I mean, if we can't gamble here, you know, you have all the money that Nevada makes. It's just our argument will never, this culture will always reject that approach, even though we know it could fund our entire public education system and healthcare potentially. Yeah.
And by the way, that's another issue, medical marijuana anyway, that could potentially be a ballot initiative in 2018.
That's the plan.
Supporters of medical marijuana are moving toward that avenue. Next question. Anonymous, are you here? Oh, Dave, there we go. David? All I saw was anonymous then. Okay. Will the Swallow shirtlift debacle do anything positive to strengthen Utah's anti-corruption laws, or will it be more years of business as usual?
Good question.
So, yeah, well, if you just took it on its face, just with the data, probably not, because, I mean, they both, you know, neither of them saw any penalty, right? And for different reasons. And I guess an interesting topic is who will have their legal bill paid by the state? John Swallow, his issue went all the way through, and so it'll be very fascinating to see how that all unfolds as well. I think whenever you mix money and politics, fundraising and politics, you create, if you have someone who isn't going to take their job serious and they're not going to approach it ethically, you're going to always see problems. I mean, it's going to. And I don't know how you set up a fence large enough and big enough to stop that, because there's always going to be someone who's going to break the rules, no matter what the rule is. I think that we saw legislation pass that did strengthen that over from the Swallow shirtlift issue. And I know, David, you were right in the middle of that whole mix. And so we saw some of that strengthened, but how far does Utah go? Will the legislature limit contributions? And I think that's probably at the heart of, if I were to say what's at the heart of your question, will there be a contribution limit on donors? We've seen it in the federal government, but that hasn't stopped people from being able to raise a lot of money. And it's not just through independent expenditure groups. I mean, Senator Hatch raised, what, $15, $18 million last election cycle. Someone asked me what it was going to take how much money it was going to be in this next cycle in 2018. Senator Hatch will be on the primary ballot. I mean, that's one of the issues with signature gathering. He will gather signatures and he will be on the primary ballot. So whoever runs against Senator Hatch needs to be prepared to spend upwards of $10 million. But think about it. The maximum an individual can give is $2,700. So on the federal level per cycle. So in this state, there are 3 cycles. Any place you can get eliminated are 3 cycles. Most federal people only take 2. So an individual can give $5,400 a year. So I don't know where you started.
In past years, I don't remember if it came up this year, but in past years, campaign finance reform has been introduced at the legislature at the state level and has gone nowhere.
So I actually wanted to make a comment about that, sort of to that point of, you know, we see this all the time as the ACLU, not necessarily in this area, but in many of the areas that we work, where there is a very legitimate and troubling problem that is occurring in our community or society, and we want to react to it, so we propose legislation, and we don't necessarily think through all the ramifications. So the ACLU nationally, somewhat famously and controversially, submitted a brief on probably the other side of what you're thinking of in Citizens United, just because we felt that there was an interest in people having access to all speech. And we've had many internal disagreements about that over the years, but some of the campaign finance legislation that's been proposed, we've actually had a problem with, because the ACLU would be swept up in fundraising reporting. We may have somebody who is very conservative who donates money to us because their kid is gay and their kid isn't out. And so there are legitimate reasons for protecting the privacy of donors and for protecting the fundraising ability of unions, which the ACLU is one. So I would just encourage you, to think creatively about some of the things that Spencer said. Are we going to push so much harder to attack 5% more corruption when it could have all of these negative ramifications on people's ability to support a political candidate of their choice or an issue that's controversial? So that's one of those issues where if you see the ACLU taking a position where you're, wondering where the heck we're coming from, especially on these issues, sometimes that's it. There are negative unintended consequences that we're not thinking through in our natural revulsion to corruption and money in politics.
The only thing I'll add, because in the last 9 years we've seen a lot of changes, nothing with regards to the cap. I think that's the only thing that's missing. But we compare to other states, and we go to meetings of legislators, and we're like walking in, it was like, oh, sorry, is it more than $5 the pen? I can't take it. It's just getting to the $5, $10. It's $10. I feel like it's
nice
$5.
pen.
It's a very nice pen. And it's funny because you sit with other legislators and they're dining and everything. We're like just sitting there like, no, we can't take any of that stuff. Thank you. Maybe some chips on the side. So it's just getting to that, and it's getting that detail. An award. If we get an award, we have to report the award, make sure it's not more than $50. We went from $25 to $50 because those nice awards sometimes are worth more than $50, and we were getting in trouble for receiving an award. And it's really embarrassing when you say, "Oh, I can't get your award. I'm sorry." So I think to me some of those have been really now are almost. I don't know that it's helping when we don't have a cap, for example, on somebody getting $150,000 contribution, and everything is fine and dandy, even though they're reporting their name and address. So the only comments in terms of what happened with this case specifically, one is how much are we going to pay? So is the state going to be now paying those bills, legal bills, which apparently they were really good legal counsel. If I'm in trouble, I know who to call now. And the other one is, did we do enough in terms of the effort to, for the prosecution of those cases, and what have we learned? And number three, is it really a different status for politicians or elected officials when things happen versus a regular citizen in the state of Utah? Are we putting people behind bars for smaller things and people getting away with other stuff? So that was some of the conversations happening after that decision.
All right, we have about 4 more minutes. I think we can get one more in. Okay, Andrea G. Okay. Is there any hope for gun reform legislation in Utah, or will this state continue to arm itself against its neighbors?
That's one amendment we try not to do at the Capitol, just because we have so many other issues. But so it doesn't seem like an area for a lot of progress in Utah.
Well, we have the 18 to 21. Now they can conceal, which I have to say, clever way to get into the universities that have been very adamant to be a free zone, place, and now they can conceal those 18 to 21. In the name of sexual assault victims, I thought that was probably the lowest you could get into making an argument about, guns, and that was just, to me, it was really, I used to work in domestic violence and sexual assault for years, and that was probably the biggest, it was very insulting for many victims of crime. It's not a solution, it's never been. I think, it's maybe a constitutional right, and people may feel really strongly about having to conceal, and I've said, look, I get it, but 18 to 21, so I'll say this, because I did pass an anti-bullying bill. Our number one issue for youth, 11 to 18, is suicide. That's the number one reason why they die in the state of Utah. Number one way of killing themselves is with a firearm. So as we're now giving, here's a concealed weapon permit for you, 18 to 21, and it really is, I don't know that it's sending the right message. aside from, the fact that people say, well, is their constitutional right, and they can still, right now, carry their gun, as long as they're showing their gun, and we got into if it's reciprocity with other states, we got actually into learning some interesting stuff. We got our legal counsel working on that, and I worked with Senator Weiler on that. I don't know that that's the right approach. I don't know 18 to 21. Brains are still developing, and it's right now with suicide being such a big problem in the state of Utah, is not the best way of handling that issue.
I did want to add one thing, and I try to work this into any time I'm talking about this legislative session because it's a big credit to the people of Utah. There was an amazing amount of public engagement at the legislature this session. The ACLU had more grassroots groups to work with that were just mobilizing on their own. And with regard to this particular issue, obviously the bill went in a way that people did not like, some people did not like, but something that was very powerful that I saw at the legislature was victims of sexual assault explicitly saying that they did not appreciate having this issue being appropriated as part of a gun control discussion. And so even if the bill passed and you disagree with access to guns, there was this reclaiming of the narrative by people who were up on the Hill who had not been there in the past. And I think that I saw some really powerful public testimony, and I think there was a bit of a backlash against some of those arguments. And I would question if those arguments would be used again in the future because there was just no support from victims of sexual assault, domestic violence community. And I thought that at least was a community that had been very marginalized and shamed in the past, standing its ground, that's the wrong word to use for this conversation, but to really drawing a line in the sand of saying, you can argue for access to guns, don't use our tragedy to do it, and I thought that was really impressive.
There are certain issues that every single year you're going to see at the legislature, no matter what. Daylight savings time.
It's a guarantee. No S on the
Okay. Thank you. Daylight saving time, alcohol, and guns. So, will there be
Dangerous
Oh, no, I know. There are many more, but those are just, 3 at the top of the list. And, will there be gun reform? I don't know. Will there be gun bills? Absolutely.
And unfortunately, and I will speak to that, unfortunately, you have, let's take LeVar Christensen, for example. You have people, and this is a sad commentary, who will use those issues to gain notoriety and political attention in their districts. And so you say to yourself, okay, where's the reform on that? Why do we have to rush out and all of a sudden cover that and give them attention, which they use then in their home precincts and districts? So many of the people who introduce those kinds of pieces of legislation are doing it for their message bills. They're wanting to up their bona fides on those topics, and that's a sad thing, but it's a reality. And I don't think I've ever been more offended for the domestic violence community than they had their issue thrown into a gun bill. It was super offensive. And I think that message was delivered loud and clear on Capitol Hill. And, hopefully we won't see those kinds of things happen in the future to use a tragedy to help pass somebody's aggressive piece of legislation. So,
all right, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. Very positive conversation and very insightful. And I'd like to thank all of you for being here as well. It's quite refreshing to see so many of you taking interest in
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Chase.